Alright, so first things first. I am creating this audio to go through paperwork that I find stressful. It is not polished, and it reminds me of a lot of stuff that I have tried very hard to forget. That said, I am willing to be vulnerable publicly because I don't think many people can do that as well. Well, I've already suffered the retaliation, so let's make the best of it. To whom it may concern, this notice is hereby submitted in accordance with Oregon Tort Claim Act to inform the state of Oregon of the intent to initiate legal proceedings based on the events described herein. What is the nature of my complaint? The too long didn't read version of my complaint is as such. As a mandatory reporter, I appropriately reported life-threatening child abuse in the business I had certified nearly 2 decades before to ensure my future children would have a safe place to grow up without the violence my father imposed on my brothers. That business plan began in 1997. In 2017, just a few weeks after an ICU stay, I was made homeless in direct retaliation for trusting the state of Oregon to appropriately respond to life-threatening physical violence against a type 1 diabetic child witnessed by Niche at OHSU and others. The most recent retaliation came in February of 2025, which I reported to numerous agencies including the Attorney General, Governor, State Police, Salem Police, Washington County's DA, and others. There is still a standing order in Marion County intended and being used successfully to intimidate me away from family, friends, employment, pursuing a degree at Portland State University, and most heinously, permanently alienating me from my now adult children because I don't even know what lies were told to others that I'm supposed to abide because I was the whistleblower. Attorney General Ellen Rosenbaum and Governor Kate Brown both used their influence over Salem First Church of the Nazarene to alienate me even further from the life I built for myself by threatening Les Back, a Boeing whistleblower who didn't even live long enough to see that he was right about a plug falling from an airplane while in flight. You can find my tears on the voicemail messages I sent to Kate Brown's office that were ignored. Carla Furter accepted my signature to place my diabetic children into foster care long enough for me to get the medical care I needed, that Dr. Scott Cook documented that I needed. Instead of receiving help accessing medical care, I was put out like a stray cat. I suffered. Now, having spent time homeless and regained my humanity while living with someone who charged rent based on my disability income instead of half of the bills, I repeatedly asked for appropriately assistance finding a path back to my children that doesn't require I lie about what happened to me. I have documented malpractice by Kaiser Permanente, affirmed by the Better Business Bureau. I have contacted Debbie Lutz Counseling Center I trusted to help my children with the violence they endured. And I have found out that therapists in Marion County, Polk County, Multnomah County, and Washington County claim to be mandatory reporters, yet refuse to report ongoing threats and intimidation intended to prevent me from publicly discussing what happened to me when I reported life-threatening child abuse in the business that I certified. I do understand the concept of he said, she said, but I was there when my children candidly discussed how one son wasn't smart enough to avoid getting beat to the Salem police officer. You can't require that we report violence if you are going to then wash your hands of the violence we endure after reporting it. I've appropriately filled out my complaint and have received your refusal to help letter given to me because my children didn't matter. I spent 20 years loving the children of my community, and when I needed to report my own son, I did so. Yet when OHSU attempted to explain to the state of Oregon how that violence was killing my diabetic son, their words didn't matter to you. I put 2/3 of my triplets into foster care because they needed help with their diabetes while I addressed a catastrophic reaction to Lupron by getting the surgery I needed, and while I gave my signature willingly because they needed protected from family, the state of Oregon instead monetized them and put me out with the message from my children's abusers that I was to go off and die alone. There is no dispute that my children endured violence from their uncles. There is no dispute that I asked the state of Oregon for help as a mandatory reporter, and there is no dispute that instead of helping me, you put me out to die on the streets of Portland. At this point, I have to see that I have experienced enough trauma to this body and my mind that I need help figuring out what to do next. But the only help afforded someone like me is for a fee that I will never have. I would be lucky to hire a lawyer with a $3,000 retainer, but I get less than $1,000 per month. Where would I get that from? I could start a campaign, but then I would be put in jail for violating an order in Marion County, silencing me, signed by the judge I trusted to protect my children from my brothers, and she instead gave my brothers her blessing to keep me silenced forever. The last retaliation came when earlier this year, before Trump had ruined our economy, I consulted with lawyers for help addressing that standing order signed by the judge who trafficked my children by paying the man who beat them to keep them away from me. There is no accusation of abuse against me, and to whatever extent neglect applies, it's worth noting that I had 20 years invested in a child care to ensure that when I was dealing with medical issues as a bleeder, I had people around to help. The state of Oregon has criminalized the symptoms of trauma. The state of Oregon required I report violence and then punished me for reporting violence. The state of Oregon went through my church to alienate me from the people who loved me and used them to estrange me permanently from the children who needed protected from violence, not the mother who was doing diabetic math on morphine waiting for surgery. There are numerous attributes to this claim, and I'm only brushing on these here to get to the process started. It would qualify as a class action if I were bold enough to be jailed again for talking about myself. I will be filing pro se because I can't afford to hire a lawyer, and I'm not seeking retribution. I would gladly settle for the right to tell my own story truthfully without the state of Oregon threatening to jail me because my truth doesn't match my brother's lies. I am not filing this claim expecting that today's snapshot of my mental health reflects in full the suffering I have endured because I trusted your predecessors. I will be listing other liable parties such as the governor, W. Lute, and Connection 365, Salem First Church of the Nazarene, our foster care program, McKay High School, the Child Care Union, Kaiser Permanente, and others because you spent 20 full years convincing me to trust you, and when it finally mattered to my children, you haven't even bothered to apologize, as Tom Brion had Rachel Parker and Eric East do. If I don't live long enough to see my children again without the fog of war, the very least I have the obligation to do is make sure others know that you aren't trustworthy, and instead of reporting as instructed, I would recommend they take their children and hide, because you monetized my children, alienated them from me, from a business, providing premium medical benefits, and allowed my brothers to use those funds towards an insurrection on that dreadful January 6th, and having refused to deal with reality and simply apologized for the hurt you've caused, we've now re-elected my brother's choice for president, and my mother, her sister, my children will all lose their Medicaid and Social Security that they didn't need until you threatened their mother using a congregation of Christians who trusted you to do the right thing. It's not a secret anymore. You've criminalized mental illness, and when I reported violence to anyone who could hear my whisper, I wasn't mentally ill. I needed surgery. I spent time in the ICU, not for mental illness, but for a physical one. So let me end this summary by saying I believe this will settle for $333.3 million if taken to its fruition. I had a promise from Rotary in Japan for investment in Marion County from the same people who built the soy sauce manufacturing plant in 1992. I had a path at PSU for building the family business into a bigger pie so that we bleeders would have medical insurance. And I had a community that loved me until you told them I was unkind for reporting life-threatening child abuse against my son of such magnitude that my mother actually called the police to report that she thought my son would be a school shooter. But instead, he was found with Becky Fink at Salem First Church of the Nazarene. I understand why my brothers wanted my life. I had everything I both needed and wanted, and the only thing I did to ruin it all was to trust you, the state of Oregon, to protect me when I blew the whistle on violence witnessed by Nitch at OHSU and others that was going to kill my son. I don't know who owes what percentage of the cash settlement that will be paid out unless we can work something out together. But I do know that there is no one in Oregon who is better documented than me, and I've been in forensic interviews from 2016 until March of 2024, and there is nothing I have to be ashamed about. I am the victim of a violent crime that was not prosecuted. I have disabilities now that I didn't have when I fled violence in Salem. I don't need you to prosecute my brothers, but I do need a path back home to my children and mother where you aren't using her to harm me ad infinitum, and I need my help earning my keep after hiding from domestic terrorism endorsed by the state of Oregon that has disconnected me from the community that would help me with my genetic bleeding disorder. Historically, I do well in print, but I can't go through this trauma over and over and over again. So I'm making the note here that I'm willing to talk to your choice of delegate to work through just how much I have suffered. Or we can jump ahead and to whatever you recommend to do next. But nothing isn't an answer I am willing to accept. I'm willing to be seen as broken so that you can see how much damage reporting violence as a mandatory reporter did to me. This notice is submitted pursuant to ORS 30.275 and within the 180-day period required under the statute. The claimant reserves all right and remedies under the law, and I list my name, address, email address, and the locations are State of Oregon in Marion, Polk, Clackamas, Multnomah, and Washington counties. And the nature of the claim involves harm that came in retaliation for reporting violence against my own child in a state-certified child care and ongoing retaliation that has no end in sight. Please consider this notice sufficient to comply with all pre-filing requirements under Oregon law. A formal complaint will follow if necessary. Respectfully submitted, Veronica Jean Anderson. This is dated on June 14th, 2025. Today's actually, I guess it is still the 14th. I list my webpage, allostasissy.studio, ALLOSTASISSY.studio, and I list my email address, my name at outlook.com. I was represented by Shelley Ashenbrenner in Washington County when I was jailed for talking to Salem police, and Joel Kinney, the man who groomed my brother into Christian nationalism in 1992. And Carla Furter represented me in Marion County when I reported violence against a child that Salem police called mutual combat. This is not a polished recording. This isn't my best. This is a snapshot of where I'm at right now, and the next thing I do is have a service serve this document appropriately to the appropriate agencies.